Okay guys, this is us continuing Chapter 8. So, the way it works with Screencast-O-Matic, you can only do 15 minutes at a time for free. So, we got cut off right around here. So I'll just start here we'll start with this paragraph just to be safe. Old Tom laid his hammer gently on the floor and put his nails in his pocket. He swung his leg over the side and dropped lithely to the ground. But once beside his son, he seemed embarrassed and strange. "Tommy," he said, "we are going to California, but we was going to write you a letter and tell you." And he said incredulously, "But you're back. You can go with us. You can go." The lid of a coffee pot slammed in the house. Old Tom looked over his shoulder. "Let's surprise him," he said, and his eyes shone with excitement. "Your ma got a bad feeling she ain't never going to see you no more. She got that quiet look like when somebody died. Almost she don't want to go to California. Fears she'll never see you no more." A stove lid clashed in the house again. "Let's surprise him," Old Tom repeated. "Let's go in like you never been away. Let's just see what your ma says." At last he touched Tom, but touched him on the shoulder, timidly, and instantly took his hand away. He looked at Jim Casey. Tom said, "You remember the preacher, Pa? He come along with me." "He been in prison too?" "No, I met him on the road. He been away." Pa shook hands gravely. "You're welcome here, sir." Casey said, "Glad to be here. It's a thing to see when a boy comes home. It's a thing to see." "Home," Pa said. "To his folks," the preacher amended quickly. "We stayed at the other place last night." Pa's chin thrust out, and he looked back down the road for a moment. Then he turned to Tom. "How'll we do her?" he began excitedly. "Suppose I go in and say, 'Here's some fellows want some breakfast.' Or how'd it be if you just come in and stood there till she seen you? How'd that be?" His face was alive with excitement. "Don't let's give her no shock," said Tom. "Don't let's scare her none." Two rangy shepherd dogs trotted up pleasantly until they caught the scent of strangers, and then they backed cautiously away, watchful, their tails moving slowly and tentatively in the air, but their eyes and noses quick for animosity or danger. One of them, stretching his neck, edged forward, ready to run, and little by little he approached Tom's legs and sniffed loudly at them. Then he backed away and watched Pa for some kind of signal. The other pup was not so brave. He looked about for something that could honorably divert his attention, saw a red chicken go mincing by, and he ran at it. There was the squawk of an outraged hen, a burst of red feathers, and the hen ran off, flapping stubby wings for speed. The pup looked proudly back at the men, and then flopped down in the dust and beat its tail contentedly on the ground. "Come on," said Pa. "Come on in now. She got to see you. I got to see her face when she sees you. Come on, she'll yell breakfast in a minute. I heard her slap the salt pork in the pan a good time ago." He led the way across the fine dusted ground. There was no porch on this house, just a step and then the door. A chopping block beside the door, its surface matted and soft from years of chopping. The graining in the sheathing wood was high, for the dust had cut down the softer wood. The smell of burning willow was in the air, and as the three men neared the door, the smell of frying side meat and the smell of high brown biscuits and the sharp smell of coffee rolling in the pot. Pa stepped up into the doorway and stood there, blocking it with his wide, short body. He said, "Ma, there's a couple fellas just come along the road, and they wonder if we could spare a bite." Tom heard his mother's voice, the remembered cool, calm drawl, friendly and humble. "Let 'em come," she said. "We got a plenty. Tell 'em they got to wash their hands. The bread is done. I'm just taking up the side meat now." And the sizzle of the angry grease came from the stove. Pa stepped inside, clearing the door, and Tom looked in at his mother. She was lifting the curling slices of pork from the frying pan. The oven door was open and a great pan of high brown biscuits stood waiting there. She looked out the door, but the sun was behind Tom, and she saw only a dark figure outlined by the bright yellow sunlight. She nodded pleasantly. "Come in," she said. "Just lucky I made plenty bread this morning." Tom stood looking in. Ma was heavy, but not fat, thick with childbearing and work. She wore a loose Mother Hubbard of gray cloth in which there had once been colored flowers. But the color was washed out now, so that the small flowered pattern was only a little lighter gray than the background. The dress came down to her ankles, and her strong, broad, bare feet moved quickly and deftly over the floor. Her thin, steel-gray hair was gathered in a sparse, wispy knot at the back of her head. Strong, freckled arms were bare to the elbow, and her hands were chubby and delicate, like those of a plump little girl. She looked out into the sunshine. Her full face was not soft. It was controlled, kindly. Her hazel eyes seemed to have experienced all possible tragedy and to have mounted pain and suffering like steps into a high calm and a superhuman understanding. She seemed to know, to accept, to welcome her position, the citadel of the family, the strong place that could not be taken. And since old Tom and the children could not know hurt or fear unless she acknowledged hurt or fear, she had practiced denying them in herself. And since, when a joyful thing happened, they looked to see whether joy was on her, it was her habit to build up laughter out of inadequate materials. But better than joy was calm. Imperturbability could be depended upon. And from her great and humble position in the family she had taken dignity and a clean, calm beauty. From her position as healer her hands had grown sure and cool and quiet. From her position as arbiter she had become as remote and faultless in judgment as a goddess. She seemed to know that if she swayed the family shook, and if she ever really deeply wavered or despaired the family would fall. The family will to function would be gone. She looked out into the sunny yard at the dark figure of a man. Pa stood nearby shaking with excitement. "Come in," he cried. "Come right in, mister." And Tom, a little shamefacedly, stepped over the doorsill. She looked up pleasantly from the frying pan, and then her hands sank slowly to her side, and the fork clattered the wooden floor. Her eyes opened wide and the pupils dilated. She breathed heavily through her open mouth. She closed her eyes. "Thank God," she said. "Oh, thank God." And suddenly her face was worried. "Tommy, you ain't wanted. You didn't bust loose?" "No, Ma. Parole. I got the papers here." He touched his breast. She moved toward him lithely, soundlessly in her bare feet, and her face was full of wonder. Her small hand felt his arm, felt the soundness of his muscles. And then her fingers went up to his cheek as a blind man's fingers might, and her joy was nearly like sorrow. Tom pulled his under lip between his teeth and bit it. Her eyes went wonderingly to his bitten lip, and she saw the little line of blood against his teeth and the trickle of blood down his lip. Then she knew, and her control came back, and her hand dropped. Her breath came out explosively. "Well," she cried, "we come mighty near to going without you, and we was wondering how in the world you could ever find us." She picked up the fork and combed the boiling grease and brought out a dark curl of crisp pork. And she set the pot of tumbling coffee back of the stove. Old Tom giggled. "Fooled you, huh, Ma? We aimed to fool you, and we done it. Just stood there like a hammered sheep. Wished Grandpa'd been here to see it. Looked like somebody beat you between the eyes with a sledge. Grandpa would have whacked himself so hard he'd have throwed his hip out, like he done when he seen Al take a shot at that great big airship the Army got. Tommy, it come over one day, 1/2 a mile big, and Al gets the 30-30 and blazes away at her. Grandpa yells, 'Don't shoot no fledglings, Al. Wait till a growed up one comes over.' And then he whacked himself and throwed his hip out." Ma chuckled and took down a heap of tin plates from a shelf. "Where is Grandpa?" Tom asked, "Where is Grandpa? I ain't seen the old devil." Ma stacked the plates on the kitchen table and piled cups beside them. She said confidentially, "Oh, him and Grandma sleeps in the barn. They got to get up so much in the night they was stumbling over the little fellas." Pa broke in. "Yeah, every night Grandpa'd get mad, tumble over Winfield, and Winfield yell, and Grandpa'd get mad and wet his drawers, and that'd make him madder, and purty soon everybody in the house be yelling their head off." His words tumbled out between chuckles. "Oh, we had lively times. One night when everybody was yelling and a-cussing, your brother Al, he's a smart aleck now, he says, 'God damn it, Grandpa, why don't you run off and be a pirate?' Well, that made Grandpa so goddamn mad he went for his gun. Al had to sleep out in the field that night, but now Grandma and Grandpa both sleeps in the barn." Ma said, "They can just get up and step outside when they feel like it. Pa, run on out and tell 'em Tommy's home. Grandpa's a favorite of him." "Of course," said Pa. "I should have did it before." He went out the door and crossed the yard, swinging his hands high. Tom watched him go, and then his mother's voice called his attention. She was pouring coffee. She did not look at him. "Tommy," she said, hesitantly, timidly. "Yeah." His timidity was set off by hers, a curious embarrassment. Each one knew the other was shy, and became more shy in the knowledge. "Tommy, I got to ask you. You ain't mad?" "Mad, Ma?" "You ain't poisoned mad? You don't hate nobody? They didn't do nothing in that jail to rot you out with crazy mad?" He looked sidewise at her, studied her, and his eyes seemed to ask how she could know such things. "No," he said. "I was for a little while, but I ain't proud like some fellas. I let stuff run off at me. What's the matter, Ma?" Now she was looking at him, her mouth open as though to hear better, her eyes digging to know better. Her face looked for the answer that is always concealed in language. She said in confusion, "I knowed Purty boy Floyd. I knowed his ma. They was good folks. He was full of hell, sure, like a good boy ought to be." She paused, and then her words poured out. "I don't know all like this, but I know it. He done a little bad thing, and they hurt him. Caught him and hurt him, so he was mad. And the next bad thing he done was mad, and they hurt him again. And purty soon he was mean mad. They shot at him like a varmint, and he shot back. And then they run him like a coyote, and him a snapping and a snarling, mean as a hobo, and he was mad. He wasn't no boy or no man no more. He was just a walking chunk of mean mad. But the folks that knowed him didn't hurt him. He wasn't mad at them. Finally they run him down and killed him. No matter how they say it in the paper how he was bad, that's how it was." She paused and licked her dry lips, and her whole face was an aching question. "I got to know, Tommy. Did they hurt you so much? Did they make you mad like that?" Tom's heavy lips pulled tight over his teeth. He looked down at his big flat hands. "No," he said, "I ain't like that." He paused and studied the broken nails, which were rigid like clamshells. "All the time in stir I kept away from stuff like that. I ain't so mad." She sighed. "Thank God," under her breath. He looked up quickly. "Ma, when I seen what they done to our house," she came near to him then and stood closely, and she said passionately, "Tommy, don't you go fighting 'em alone. They'll hunt you down like a coyote. Tommy, I got to thinking and dreaming and wondering. They say there's 100,000 of us shoved out. If we was all mad the same way, Tommy, they wouldn't hunt nobody down." She stopped. Tommy, looking at her, gradually dropped his eyelids, until just a short glitter showed through his lashes. "Many folks feel that way?" he demanded. "I don't know. They're just kind of stunned, walking around like they was half asleep." From outside and across the yard came an ancient creaking bleat. "Praise God for Vittery! Praise God for Vittery!" Tom turned his head and grinned. "Grandma finally heard 'em home, Ma," he said. "You never was like this before." Her face hardened and her eyes grew cold. "I never had my house pushed over," she said. "I never had my family stuck out on the road. I never had to sell everything. Here they come now." She moved back to the stove and dumped the big pan of bulbous biscuits on 2 tin plates. She shook flour into the deep grease to make gravy, and her hand was white with flour. For a moment Tom watched her, and then he went to the door. Across the yard came 4 people. Grandpa was ahead, a lean, ragged, quick old man, jumping with quick steps and favoring his right leg, the side that came out of joint. He was buttoning his fly as he came, and his old hands were having trouble finding the buttons, for he had buttoned the top button into the second buttonhole, and that threw the whole sequence off. He wore dark ragged pants and a torn blue shirt open all the way down, and showing in long gray underwear also unbuttoned. His lean white chest, fuzzed with white hair, was visible through the opening in his underwear. He gave up the fly and left it open and fumbled with his underwear buttons, then gave the whole thing up and hitched his brown suspenders. His was a lean, excitable face with little bright eyes as evil as a frantic child's eyes. A cantankerous, complaining, mischievous, laughing face. He fought and argued, told dirty stories. He was as lecherous as always, vicious and cruel and impatient, like a frantic child, and the whole structure overlaid with amusement. He drank too much when he could get it, ate too much when it was there, talked too much all the time. Behind him hobbled Grandma, who had survived only because she was as mean as her husband. She had held her own with a shrill, ferocious religiosity that was as lecherous and as savage as anything Grandpa could offer. Once, after a meeting, while she was still speaking in tongues, she fired both barrels of a shotgun at her husband, ripping one of his buttocks nearly off. And after that he admired her and did not try to torture her as children torture bugs. As she walked, she hiked her Mother Hubbard up to her knees, and she bleated her shrill, terrible war cry, "Praise God for Vittery!" Grandma and Grandpa raced each other to get across the broad yard. They fought over everything, and loved and needed the fighting.